Welcome to the Grid Podcast, episode 23. Our goal is to educate and to bring hard-hitting truths about America's critical infrastructure. I'm your host, Maria Sumnicht. A quick disclaimer, political opinions expressed in the podcast by participants are their opinions and not necessarily that of the Grid Podcast. Please share, subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell so you can be notified when we go live. This helps promote the channel on YouTube. So today's topic, bringing the gap between engineering and network security, OT/IT, a cultural chasm. So today we welcome two very esteemed guests to our show, and I'd like to start off by welcoming back Joe Weiss. What a pleasure it is to have you back on the podcast, Joe. Joe is a control system cyber expert and an international authority on cybersecurity, control systems, and system security. And then new on the podcast is Dr. Darrell Eilts, Chief Information Officer for the Sewage and Water Board of New Orleans, where he leads enterprise technology, cybersecurity, and operational technology governance in support of the utility's critical infrastructure mission. So welcome, Darrell. We'll start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background, and then we'll go over to Joe, and then we'll dive right into our discussion.
Hi, thank you, Maria, and appreciate everybody joining us. So my name is Darrell Eilts. I serve as Chief Information Officer, as Maria said, for the Sewage and Water Board of New Orleans. This is in probably one of the country's oldest and most complex municipal utilities. So my responsibility there, as she mentioned, spans IT, cybersecurity, and operational technology governance. My background is cross-sector, fairly cross-sector. I started in the Marine Corps. Moved into federal agencies like the National Finance Center. I did financial services for a regional bank institution, and eventually coming into the role of critical infrastructure organization. So along the way, I picked up the PhD and a few certifications to include CISSP and the CISM, excuse me. And I also teach graduate level courses at local university and participate in industry advisory boards. And then I also serve as the Louisiana Water and Wastewater Sector Chief for the FBI InfraGard of Louisiana. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak here and participate in this conversation.
Joe?
Hi, Maria. Again, thanks for inviting me again. I'm, excuse me, actually a control system engineer, really a nuclear engineer, whose specialty was instrumentation, controls, and equipment diagnostics. And so my life was always about reliability, availability, and safety. And then lo and behold, in 2000, I helped start the Control System Cybersecurity Program at the Electric Power Research Institute. So I have kind of this dual-hatted thing where, yes, I'm cyber, but I'm the engineering part of cyber. I for 12 years, I was the managing director of the International Standards on Control System Cybersecurity, which is ISA 99, which the 62443 series of standards. So to me, what's really neat is having the opportunity to have this discussion, both Maria with you and also with Darrell, because we need all three sides to make this all work.
Yeah, let's just go ahead and dive into this discussion, which will be on engineering and network security collaboration. So Darrell and Joe will discuss issues that they have identified in their upcoming June 2026 IEEE Computer Magazine article called "Packets and Process: What Network Security and Engineering Get Wrong About Each Other." So just so we're kicking it off and everyone is working from the same baseline, I'm going to throw this right into the arena. So what is your definitions of each one of you of OT and control systems? Joe, why don't you start?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, a little bit of background. Until 2006, there was no term OT. OT was defined in 2006 in a paper that Gartner wrote for a conference. And it was basically meant to be able to separate IT from engineering or networks from engineering. And it's gotten a life of its own. Um, OT, in my view, excuse me, are the networks and the network people, those that are working on quote unquote control system networks. What OT is not the equipment. OT is not a turbine, it's not a motor, it's not a valve, it's not a protective relay, it's not a transformer. The communications going to those devices would be OT. So and the other point I wanted to bring out is OT is a term that is pretty well known in the security community. But if you reach outside the security community and you go to an engineering conference and you bring up the term OT, an awful lot of people are going to look at you quizzically because many, many engineers do not consider themselves to be OT. So we need to really try and focus on what context we're using that term.
And I think my variation probably does not stray too much from Joe there in the way I would describe it. So I think most people think of traditional cybersecurity as protecting data, which leans back towards the IT area of responsibility. But how I would describe it is OT cybersecurity is different in that you're protecting the systems and control of physical process like your pumps and your valves, chemical dosing systems. And when those fail, you're not dealing with data breach issues or exposure of information. You're dealing with public health emergency situation. So the importance here, and maybe this is a little bit getting into the philosophical side, but the IT principles in what we learn in cybersecurity is the foundation of the CIA triad, or some people might argue a little. So confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and coming through the IT channels. Those are the pillars. That's the foundations which we learn and practice our information security. And then there's arguments, of course, in that we can expand on that to non-repudiation or authentication. So basically, the what is it, the Parker hex model. So there's other factors, but we're still built on the CIA principles. OT has different principles. It's safety first, and then reliability and the productivity of systems. So those are the principles that engineers are built on, and those two worlds collide sometimes, and that goes to the heart of what Joe and I have been discussing. But I guess it's been many months now. But what's this IT? What is exactly the IT OT divide in security? And then how do we bridge that divide? How do we improve this from an industry perspective? Because this has been going on more than 2 decades now, and we've tried to have an honest conversation, and that's what we're addressing in our article. Is that from our respective fields, let's be honest and critical of each other, and have this conversation, and what's it really going to take to bring the two groups closer, and have those conversations. So. But those, I think, are the philosophical pillars that the two perspectives are coming from, and neither is wrong. It's a different, what we call framing of cybersecurity. think you're on mute.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I do that just to avoid any background noise. So, in order to frame this discussion even further, Joe and I were talking prior, and we just want to sort of lay a little bit more groundwork. And so, there are a few people in engineering that are cognizant of control system cyber and vice versa, right? OT people that are cognizant of of each other. But what we need is more is more to be aware. So this is what this discussion is all about. And at this point, I'm going to kick it off to these two gentlemen to talk about that.
Sure. I'll jump in first and maybe lay a foundation because one of the things Joe and I had looked at recently was a publication from CISA. And that was titled Barriers to Secure OT Communication, Why Johnny Can't Authenticate. And if anybody's familiar with the Why Johnny Can't series, I think it was circa 1999 or 2000, there was an article titled Why Can't Johnny Encrypt? Then there was probably 6 years later another article, Why Johnny Still Can't Encrypt? And then another one 3 years after that, he still can't. So Johnny's been facing this problem for quite some time, and I know there's been some spin-off on Johnny can't build secure applications, and so the position of Johnny is that he keeps running into either these technological barriers or cultural issues, and when Joe and I started this conversation, and we're looking at the real issue of what Johnny's having, it's not. CISA does a great job. Don't get me wrong. The importance of that work is really great. The article is really great. They look at the real barriers, the cost, the complexity, organizational or operational disruption, and they gave very practical recommendations on how to better, implement encryption or certificate management, or even introduce stronger authentication protocols within the network. So that kind of guidance is exactly what the field needed more of. And I think people can genuinely, who care about this, are looking to get it right. So the thing is, though, that the document assumes that the threat lives at the communication channel. And in order to solve the problem, you lock down that communication channel. And that's where Joe and I started conversing that, maybe that's a false assumption in terms of when you look at sensors and measuring pressure and temperature flow at the actuators and running pumps, that those devices don't have authentication to configure. And that gets into the sub-layer, the lower layers of the Purdue model. So not that Johnny can't authenticate is a problem. Johnny's not having the right conversation. And Maria, I appreciate you bringing us together so that we can have this conversation and figure out how Johnny can be better. But all kidding aside, I think that the gap here is the real gap between IT and OT security is not architectural. It's not fully technical. It is cultural, in that when you bring both the network security professionals together and the engineers to think in terms of packets and process, that we can really get to the point of how to bridge this. And that's what our article addresses.
Joe, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts. One is, in a sense, technical about how you would use encryption. Another is, do we even care about the encryption? When you're dealing with data in motion, that's going to occur, rapidly. You're talking milliseconds, whatever. And after that, it doesn't matter. So the idea of trying to encrypt when you're talking about data in motion isn't as important as data at rest. data at rest, you really want to encrypt, you really want to secure because it's going to be there, unchanging for a long time. One of the things we looked at when I was first starting the EPRI program back in 2000, when it came to encryption, was technologically, could we even do it? You look at PKI, public key infrastructure, elliptical, cryptography, you name it. Our devices have limited computing resources. Many of them simply don't have the resources to be able to do encryption. And even some that do can't do it in a rapid enough time frame because these are what's called deterministic systems. So everything has to happen within a very, very, very short period of time. And if it doesn't, it's effectively a denial of service. Mm-hmm. What we are really interested in, and this goes back to the culture, we're not necessarily interested in the who is sending the data or if the data has been changed, whatever. I mean, we were worried to some extent. But what we really want to know is the authentication of that data stream. Is that sensor signal actually coming from the sensor or has it been spoofed? So to me, the encryption, the value of the encryption was it would be able to give us a form of authentication. Not do I trust the bits and bytes, but can I really have confidence where it's coming from? The problem kept coming back to our devices and a lot of the microprocessors for our devices simply do not have the capability for handling that encryption, if you will. I don't want to say overload, but the encryption process. And one of the things that I think is different or needs to really be addressed is the concept of encryption is really for data. Mm-hmm. What we really need, which is authentication, and if you will, integrity, can that be accomplished without the overhead that you get from normal encryption processes? But there haven't been many, or certainly as many discussions here as there should be.
So one of the things that specifically that we looked at, and going back to integrity and authentication, were that most of the cybersecurity investment concentrate at levels 2 through 4 of the Purdue model reference. Now where familiar IT concepts apply, levels 0 and 1 are a different story. So process sensor, actuators, field devices, as Joe mentioned, the authentication encryption doesn't exist. There's no security logs or no support, forensic support available on serialized communication between those devices. And you cannot distinguish between a valid command and a malicious one. So packet integrity is not the same thing as data integrity. And a sensor reporting false value or transmission of falsified information may have a perfectly formed packet. So that's the distinction and why we title this packets versus process. And securing the network, above it doesn't address those vulnerabilities. So, we even have to explore the discussion of the Purdue model overlap with the OSI model and familiarity with it. So if you look at authentication from an OSI perspective, you can have some authentication in the data link layer through 802.1x or what other port-based authentication protocols. But really, it's layer 3 at the network level where IPsec can authenticate. And that doesn't translate well to levels 0 and 1 of the Purdue model. So there's not only a model gap, functional gap, there's technical gaps, um, but the problem in the framing of this, going back to what we investigated and look, why did this happen, and how do we get back to writing the industry to the path where we can get to more stable security posture across the board, is that first you look at the framing of what's generally accepted as the term IT OT convergence. So that itself implies that the two domains are merging, which I don't think either Joe or I believe that to be the case. Truly, the framing of that leaves out the physical processes. So IT security, like I said, we protect data confidentiality, we protect integrity and availability. It's the CIA principles that I spoke of. OT security has to protect the chemical reactions, the fluid dynamics, the electrical loads, mechanical forces. Those are fundamentally different problems than things that are happening at the packet level process, because information is being sent. We can get uh, validation that it was sent across the network. It does a checksum validation, and it looks good on our end. So from an IT perspective, we don't have any way to challenge or question whether something's been malformed or even if it's compromised. And that's really kind of at the heart of the problem here in the divide between the two.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to go on a bit of a tangent for a second. And it's basically dealing with, if you will, forensics.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to talk about RTUs, remote terminal units. Okay. That's used in water, it's used in electricity, it's used all over. It's basically a device that essentially captures the sensor data and sends it on. And what was happening was one of the most popular RTUs around had what was called a circular buffer. So, what it would do is it would gather information, and at times it would be by exception. In other words, if the data wasn't changing, it didn't take it. But the point being, it would gather this data, maybe a day's worth or a week's worth or whatever, and then the next set of data would overwrite it. So the engineers, this is, if you will, this difference in culture. The engineers were looking, in a sense, at the shorter term. Do I have a problem now? And if I don't seem to have a problem now, I don't need to worry about capturing the data. Well, when you start talking about cyber, some of this stuff may not be evident early on. But the design of that buffer was, again, it was designed for a different reason. And one of the issues we keep having between engineering and networks, you'll notice I'm not using the word OT or IT, but engineering and networks, is they were designed for different purposes. It wasn't, you keep hearing, well, they weren't designed for security, but that's kind of a misnomer. It's not what they were not designed for, it's what they were designed for. So they were designed to capture data, but a finite amount of data, and if nothing happened, get rid of it. Now, obviously, storage is now much cheaper than it used to be. There are ways maybe to get around. But the point being, our systems were designed on the engineering side to do different things. And one of the real issues here is during the design process, the people that were involved in the design process were the vendors and their customers. Who are their customers? The engineers. Who are not their customers? The security people. So from the beginning, these systems were designed specifically for certain functions. One of the things that's missing, and this what this whole discussion is about, is if we don't have engineering and network people involved from the beginning, the equipment and the access and everything else is going to be good for one and bad for the other. And that's not really happening.
I think Joe makes a great point here, and if there's any foot stomper, that's going to be it. And I'll add to that by saying, part of the cultural divide is one, the reality of how most industrial systems and utilities are built. We're in an era where systems were designed pre-internet, and we still have, analog control rooms. I mean, there's it doesn't matter whether it's water utility or electrical grid or most of our infrastructure still has legacy technology that even if and this is addressed in this is an article as well, is that it takes a significant amount of financial investment to modernize across the board. So we have these limitations there, but there's the cultural divide also that exists within our education system and how we're so Joe and I talked about the disconnect really in academia and exploring that a little bit in terms of computer science programs rarely require engineering coursework, and then likewise engineering programs don't really require cybersecurity or IT security. So the two professional communities there, they're expected to collaborate, but they're never really taught the same language. And what I mean by that is specifically in risk. So when IT professionals speak in terms of risk management, we're looking at outage time, mean time to recovery. It's all centered in risk metrics that are based on the IT framework mindset. In the operation side, or you're measuring risk in impact on physical systems that ultimately, like I said, result in health consequences. So we're essentially not speaking the same language. Sometimes we're talking past each other, not to each other, in terms of the two professional communities. So that pattern carries itself into industry, where engineers rarely attend cybersecurity conferences, or vice versa, or cybersecurity professionals rarely attend engineering conferences. So part of the process here is to take a critical look at the programs and the institutions that are grooming the next generation of utility workers and professionals in critical infrastructure organizations, and being more inclusive to how those two overlap. But then also from the top down, you look at organizations, and I've been part of boardroom discussions where if I explain what is OT, it doesn't get through, and they'll either refer to it as referring to overtime, or referring to occupational therapy. Like the operational technology wasn't in their vocabulary to know. These are some of the questions that need to be explored from high level leadership. So there's a what I would say bottom up, or the academia, the institutional grooming of education in creating professionals. There's also the leadership aspect that needs to be addressed in terms of are our current leaders addressing the right cybersecurity questions, and and then if you look at things from really the middle out, we can identify areas that there's plenty of opportunity room for improvement on those fronts. So what all of this leads to is that Joe and I have been really looking at what are the organizational blind spots that process operators have, and how do we detect anomalies, because they are not trained to think cyber, and cybersecurity staff aren't trained to think that they understand the normal processes of machinery that they're trying to protect. That's where we need the engineering conversation. We need to bring them to the table. So before I engage in an IT policy or a governance structure, I have to bring in that engineering mindset to help me better understand within the organization how that impacts the operational governance of systems.
I had a couple of things to add. The first, when Darrell brought up, the vocabulary or the nomenclature, a number of years ago, I gave a presentation at a critical infrastructure InfraGard meeting in San Francisco. So that meant the local utilities were there, both electric and water, whatever. And I started talking about IEDs. Now remember, this is supposedly cyber of critical infrastructure. For those that don't know, an IED stands for an intelligent electronic device. That's your smart breaker, in a substation or for any the equipment. Well, if you're physical security, what is an IED? It's an improvised explosive device. My joke is we don't want the IED to become an IED. But it was just mind blowing to me that this session that was in, I think it was in PG&E's, complex. It was either that or it was at the CEC. But that this very, very important term wasn't understood by both. Or conversely, here's what was worse. Each heard the term IED, and each went off in its own direction thinking they understood the conversation. Okay? Now, the other thing Darrell brought up is really, really, really important to me. And it's really been hurting us a lot. It's called root cause. What happens is both, the network security and engineering will do a root cause when there is a problem that occurs. But today, and I'm going to say this in general, okay, is if you have a problem and it appears to be electrical or mechanical in nature, you're not going to have participation from network security. Conversely, if there's an anomaly that's been found in the packets, you're probably not going to have any engineering participation in that analysis. And we've got to get to the point where, particularly on the equipment side, that both engineering and network security at least start looking at it to, if nothing else, be able to eliminate it, but not a priori saying this doesn't affect you, you don't have to be here. And that's a really big problem, and it's occurred in any number of real control system cyber cases that have occurred.
I'm gonna probably poke Joe a little bit here because he and I have discussed what I'll coin as the definition problem, right?
Yes.
So it centers around a cybersecurity incident not having malicious intent, and there's been well documented cases about incidents that either should or could have been framed as a cyber incident. And the current industry practice is restricting the definition to malicious network intrusion, which excludes the majority of control systems events that actually cause physical harm. So without having that, then the framing of that definition problem, it means we define it cyber, too narrowly. If we're isolating this to the network side, so maybe from the IT side, the easiest example here is, looking in our own backyard is, the 24 incident from CrowdStrike. We know that had impacts that crashed over 8 million computers worldwide, and airlines grounded, hospitals lost access to records. I mean, banks went down, emergency services. There's this interdependency that some people are starting to talk about it more, but the interdependency between critical infrastructure organizations that really takes precedent here. That if, for example, water, if we lose the ability to make water, that's going to have a clear impact on our healthcare systems. If we lose the ability to produce energy, that's going to have a clear impact on our fuel systems. If we lose communication, that's going to impact. So all of critical infrastructure is interdependent on each other, and all of these vulnerabilities have cascading effect and impacts on the others. So, and I applaud all the professionals here on this call that are working to help improve our posture. But we know that when these services are disrupted, there's billions in economic damage, and a reasonable definition here that something is a cyber incident because nobody did it on purpose, or it was a quote unquote issue with a device failure. That's inherently wrong in terms of how things are looked at. So if we can agree, first of all, on within our domains that we can agree on that definition, then, well, I guess I'll say it this way: if we can't agree, then we're going to continue to have this gap problem in how we classify our incidents.
Okay. Again, this is neat. This is point counterpoint. I hope people are enjoying this. A couple of things. Prior to Stuxnet, we were able, I think, in most cases, to recognize the difference between an oops and a malicious event. What Stuxnet demonstrated was that a sophisticated attacker could make a cyber attack look like an equipment malfunction. Don't forget, Iran was operating those centrifuges for well over a year. They were being torn apart. They could hear them, but they never thought that cyber played a role. So the first point is, we don't necessarily know whether it was or wasn't, if you will, malicious. But here's the other thing that I don't think many people consider, but I truly believe the malicious types do. A non-malicious incident effectively becomes a template for an attacker. They know from this, if this type of situation occurs, you will get a physical impact. Whereas if you try to go about it from the network side, you may or may not get, a real physical outcome. But this unintentional incident has demonstrated what could happen. And one of the things that also brings up is often the impact is the same whether it was malicious or unintentional. So trying to separate them, again, I look at it that Stuxnet was kind of a dividing line, because from Stuxnet, from 2010 on out, we don't necessarily know whether it was malicious or unintentional. And we had cases, big cases with very big outcomes, where the only difference between it being malicious versus unintentional was the motivation of, in this case, the engineer in a substation. There was nothing that you would have been able to see from any network to tell you anything. And oh, by the way, this took out half of a state for 8 hours. This is not trivial. Okay. The other thing I want to bring up, and I tried bringing this up at a NERC meeting and others, and people look at interdependencies as water affects power, affects telecom, affects water, affects manufacturing. In the control system world, one of our biggest interdependencies is our vendors. That same identical Siemens, ABB, Emerson, Honeywell, Schneider, Pickett, that same identical piece of equipment is in every single one of those infrastructures you just mentioned. If there is a problem inherent to those devices, that affects every single one of those infrastructures.
Yep.
And it is missed in almost everything I've ever seen coming out of NERC, the government, any of the industry. It's all pictures showing, the arrows about which industry touches which and back and forth. The other thing I really want to point out too, when you talk about control system cybersecurity, you are really talking, especially at level 0, you are talking about safety, reliability, productivity, predictive maintenance, and cybersecurity comes along for the ride.
Mm-hmm.
You do it right, either you can prevent a cyber event or you can detect a cyber event. That's one thing that makes control system cyber different than, if you will, IT or network cyber, in that you have the opportunity in front to either prevent or detect cyber issues, because at that level, it's not data.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the key point, maybe to echo that, is that no critical infrastructure can be cyber secure when engineering network security operate with different cultures and
Right.
Yes.
and with separate vocabularies, separate tools. The tools and standards and frameworks will not fix that problem. The culture has to change that first. And and even on the point of frameworks, we apply frameworks as if the environments were uniform. I've built zero trust roadmaps. I've stood up patch management programs in organizations to align, NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27000 series. So these frameworks work in enterprise environments. The mistake is assuming that they extend clearly or neatly into an OT without adaptation. So zero trust implies that devices participate, as we mentioned, in authentication and then there's continuous verification and process sensors, legacy controls, they can't do that. So that data exchange in that control loop happens as Joe mentioned, in milliseconds. And there's no room for the authentication, quote unquote, handshake. And then even if you look at patching in IT, it's a primary control, or SIEM systems are, how we detect anomalies. That's our center base for monitoring and control. So, but when you talk in terms of patching and control systems for known vulnerabilities, OT patching is a change that validated systems may affect timing or vendor support or process stability. And those aren't the same problems that we see in IT. So what actually happens in practice is that these compliance teams, they'll flag OT systems as quote unquote unpatched against the same standards that we're using for Windows server-based systems, and audit findings and of the technical controls are really operationally meaningless. So, and maybe back to Joe's point on specific vendors. If you look at the Unitronics and what happened with that breach in, what was it, late 23. So the Iranian built systems are in multiple sectors, and that compromise, I think, is still unresolved to this day. So the deeper vulnerability here is architectural, and Unitronics devices, they combine operator interface and control, those units. But the issue here is that I think it wasn't fully addressed. There's still vulnerability within the communities that use these components, or if Iranian threat actors, had gained access to the programming logic layer, then we know there's several issues with living off the land and other threats that are out there that potentially could materialize and affect our homeland security posture with our critical infrastructure organization. So you don't see those discussed in IT circles, and that's where bringing these two groups together to have that discussion on what are the threats, what are the priorities is very helpful, for those working in this environment.
Yep. Linda. Oh, I shouldn't say it. My wife can tell you I'm usually far behind discussions when they occur. So I want to start with patching and go to the other. One of the issues in the control system world is we don't use Microsoft patches or Microsoft Windows, because whether it's ABB or Honeywell or Emerson, Schneider, you name it, they take that operating system and it's been modified. So if you pull down a quote unquote normal Microsoft patch and you try to apply it, you will shut the system down.
Yep.
Part of the reason it takes long to do this, and by the way, having said that, you think about CrowdStrike, and what did we do? We applied it without testing. Industry blew their own policies and procedures. But the thing I want to talk about the patching point was that you have to test these specific patches that are coming from your vendor. Mm-hmm. You can't just put in a generic patch, okay? And that often gets lost in the IT discussions where they're going, why don't you do that? There's one other point too. In a number of instances in multiple industries, we have critical workstations that if that workstation goes down, the process goes down. And that might be a steel mill, it may be a power plant, you name it. Because of that, we cannot do patching until the facility is down for maintenance. And that can be 3 to 5 years. So part of what is going on is we have to be able to figure out, how do we work around not being able to patch because we physically can't until the next interval comes around. Now that's not every system, but there are really critical systems that fall into that category.
So Joe, when I was in New York City, I actually worked with New York City's legal beagles, and we updated all technology purchasing agreements, including the renewal of licensing on-prem, in the cloud, whatnot. The only thing that saved New York City from that CrowdStrike disaster was the fact that inside the updated technology agreements, no one was allowed to update without it being tested prior to deployment. And that is something that is very simple to do. Now, simple, you should just be able to go to your attorneys, your company attorneys, your municipal, who's ever working that, and get that into your contract for these things, for, especially for critical systems. So you don't get updated automatically whenever a manufacturer decides to push it out, because in your legal agreement you say if they cause any damages or anything happens in the city, that they are responsible for the losses. That gets them going right there. And so you have to, things like that, you can address through legal contracts, in, whether you're a municipality, an enterprise, whatever, government agency, you take care of that legally, and no company wants to be responsible for something like that.
And I'll pick on my
Yeah.
own discipline here because there's probably a reason why it's Patch Tuesday and then Chaos Wednesday, right? So,
Yes.
so we know that, and the reality is on enterprise systems, and that the level of support needed to regularly test implementation of patches is very high. So, I wish that was the case, that we could be more disciplined and have that built in either as a contract mechanism or from resource allocation perspective to go through those tests and not do the break fix and kind of environment that we do in IT. So maybe that's a good model for OT, but that's the cadence differential between patching very chatty IT systems to OT systems that were built to run for decades, and that's there's an inherent difference there, and our teams have recognized that. So they'll we have standing work groups that go through our so I'm hoping I can't discuss too much of our own environment, but we have segmentation. We have between our SCADA systems and our enterprise IT network, as most utilities should. But when you say segmentation, there's also an aspect of, okay, how are we getting that information to run patches on some of these systems when you're basically now referring back to SneakerNet, where you're downloading it on a thumb drive from the IT system and then running around patching systems. So that is a hole in your security layers of defense. And now what we're seeing is even worse, is that you put an HMI system out there, or an HMI out there that the vendor's requiring Bluetooth to that device. You've just blown a hole through every layer of our security model so that the vendors can essentially patch our system. So these are what we're seeing and facing in reality with how we govern and the operational standpoint of protecting the systems and then ensuring their reliability and safety. So and I know we're not alone in this too.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's cover a couple. I mean, not a couple. There's actually quite a few. So let's
I know.
just
I was gonna.
let's go
I
through.
was gonna try and answer a couple.
Yeah, I was gonna scroll up here and start here. Let's see what the very first one. Okay, what are common cybersecurity threats in OT environments? Joe?
Again, you have. I want to distinguish between network environments and equipment environments. Okay. network environments, whether it's IT or OT, are pretty much the same. Equipment gets different for a couple reasons. One, you have physics issues, so that this equipment is designed to be able to work or operate, if you will, close to the safety edge. That's where equipment is most efficient. So if you, via cyber or electronics, push the equipment over that edge where it's now in an unstable environment, you can cause real damage. That's not corrupting anything. You'll look at, for example, Stuxnet. Stuxnet was not trying to, if you will, compromise networks. It was simply using the network to send, quote unquote, a warhead off.
Yep.
You look at Aurora, that's simply pushing equipment into an unstable operating regime. So, what is going on when you talk about the engineering side is, how do I get the equipment to operate in a unstable or unsafe regimen?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done anything to the networks. This is another reason why you've got to have both sides there, because the incidents aren't just network related. And that's a really big, I just came back from RSA last week. And effectively everything it's got to be network related. Well, it's not the case. The other thing I wanted to mention too is this, and I kind of said it before, because we don't necessarily have engineering and security working together, we have vendors that are now building new products with web servers in these control system or sensors. From an engineering perspective, that's terrific. From a cyber perspective, maybe not so terrific. But that's what, from the beginning, we've got to be there. The other thing I wanted to mention, because it was in one of these things, we keep talking about problems, not solutions. Okay. Solutions at the engineering level are different than solutions at the network layer. And that actually is a positive, because what that's saying is we can look at, for example, monitoring of sensors at the physics layer. You can do that where, in a sense, it can't be hacked. But what it's telling you is the process working as it should? Because if the process is working as it should, to an engineer, the system is fine. If there is a network problem associated, go look at it and fix it, but it's not impacting, if you will, that the water system or the boiler or whatever. We have a difference where we can create solutions for control systems that you cannot create when your entire focus is data.
So I like Joe's response there, and that he's pivoting back to solution, because that's the core of what we wanted to have, the honest conversation, respective of our fields, and I'll speak for myself. I'm not the authority figure for all of IT, but us coming to the table and just letting our guard down and saying, okay, let's look at things and understand better, and how to address this. And Joe and I have started that conversation. That's what we're publishing.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we've leaned toward is providing practical recommendations going forward in not only how we uh, uh, get engineers in the room together. I think David in chat asked a really good question of what are we doing differently, how are we bringing the two to the table. So I want to speak to that. And something I've done in practice is that we've set up a executive governance structure in that, because right now and this is what we're seeing in a lot of utilities, is that our operational technology is in the balance of generally falling towards operational side or engineering, and with our org structure, I have the oversight of governance, compliance, risk, strategy, and sometimes those two areas collide. So the day-to-day guidance or direction like for our SCADA team, still comes from the engineers. So even though they're in our arena, classified as IT specialists for whatever reason. So part of that is changing the definitions in the industry. I mean, we know that I think recognizing the OT discipline as its own is something that we can work on. I think there's certainly things that within, as I mentioned, the academic upbringing and grooming of specialists in this field, there are nuance to either IoT, SCADA, industrial control systems that need to learn from the engineering side and vice versa, and that needs to come together. So what we're doing in practice too is that we have regular working groups of our professionals. So we're bringing our cybersecurity professionals and the operations side together to meet weekly and discuss and plan and coordinate up and down the Purdue model and understand the respective environments a little bit more collaboratively. So that's not a prescriptive measure to everybody on this call. I'm just saying that's what we're doing in practice, or what I've done in practice, and I think it's something we need to see more of.
I agree. Maria, you're muted.
Yeah, do you want to pick a question out of the chat, Joe? There's quite a few of them.
Tell you what, I'll let you.
Here's one. So does China make many of our OT hardware components?
Yep.
There you go. I knew that'd be an easy one.
In fact, both, unfortunately, not only whitelisted, but also gray listed. In other words, where it actually says it's coming from China, and others where you have Chinese components, or they've literally taken the Chinese nameplate off and put on a US nameplate over it.
Well, here's another great question. How much testing? So it says the SolarWind compromise was silent for 3 weeks. Do we need to test for 4 weeks, 6 weeks? Who wants to take that one? Darrell?
I don't know if I have the answer to that for the industry. There's, that was a very unfortunate event. I'll say that, and the fact that it took so long to discuss. So I was part of NASA at the time that happened, and we were on a different solution. So fortunately, it did not affect me or my teams, but just seeing the impact and of the industry and just that it brought to light really the problem in having that patch and forget mentality that our expectation on major vendors is that they're hitting these 0-day vulnerabilities, they're giving us solutions, and that they're testing within their own environments, and clearly that wasn't the case. So I don't know honestly the answer to that.
I mean, from my perspective, I go back to, as an engineer, if I'm monitoring the process in real time, then regardless of what's going on, I'm going to find perturbations or I'm not going to find perturbations. If I don't find perturbations, then I really don't care. Now, that's as an engineer, as you know, the network people need to worry about that. But in terms of, am I going to blow up a boiler or am I going to, over chlorinate or whatever, I'm going to know that because I'm monitoring that in real time.
Yeah, and maybe I think the point we're trying to make too is that CrowdStrike was not a malicious attack, but look at
Right.
the impact and the economic damage, and so when you look at cybersecurity frameworks, it's more than just the patching cycles and how we protect our organization. So if we're defining incident response and actionable items based on whether something is malicious or not, then we need to consider that, because I think the IT community, the community at large, resisted calling CrowdStrike a cyber incident because it wasn't intentional, and that's really the flawed framework, so to speak.
Yeah. And
And
I'm
then,
just I'm just going to mention something really quick, because there was a question is, how do you get everybody to the table? It really just takes one person to stand up and say something. I'm going to give an example. In 2020, I was given a project to finish a network security assessment of probably one of the country's largest freshwater and reclaimed water facilities. And things were pretty bad. Both parties were not talking to each other. I decided to take it, and what I realized really quick is that the cybersecurity side, or the IT side, did not understand that there was an engineering side. And what had happened is the engineers were saying, that's great, you're doing this, and that, but it doesn't really matter because you're not really addressing the problem. And the IT side said, well, we don't really need you guys. You guys, if we just do this, if we put in a logging and monitoring tool, everything will be okay. This is over in the OT side, right? So they weren't getting it. They didn't understand the other side. And my background was not on either side. So I was sort of a neutral person that had been brought in to kind of mend fences. And I sat down with engineering. At first they wouldn't meet with me, because they said, oh, you're just one of them. So you're just one of them. All right. And I said, well, no, not really, just give me a chance. And so I listened to their side, and then and that's when it dawned on me, and I'm like, oh my goodness, there's this whole other side called what? Control systems? I had no clue, because I was one of them. I was over in the cyber side, but I was willing to just learn, okay, and listen and learn, and so within like 3 months, finally I got everybody to the table. 3 months later, after I convinced everyone, you have to hear each other out. We want to really truly secure these facilities. We have to sit down together and work together, and that there's got to be a catalyst, somebody to bridge that gap,
Yeah.
and that's the one thing I can say. And if no matter which side you're on, the engineering or the IT, and why don't you be that? It doesn't take much just to reach out and do it.
And I agree with that point wholeheartedly. So, I talked about, leadership and what leadership needs to do, but, champions come from all levels of an organization. And you're exactly right on point. And it actually goes back to I'm seeing in a comment, another David comment, he nailed on the head here in saying that, when you talk about OT and IT convergence, it ignores the people part. And
Yes.
that's exactly right. So, we need to consider that within not only how we build, I guess looking at it this way, cybersecurity policies and risk frameworks and incident response plans, they're written by IT security professionals with little or no participation from engineers who design and operate the systems that we're protecting, right? So, and to that point, and kind of drilling home what we discussed earlier, is that engineers get called after the fact that something breaks, not during the policy development. And even as an IT professional, spent a lot of time in software development early on in my career. That if you build that process in early to the conversation of a design and development, bring the engineers into the conversation, get their perspective, so that it's better to build in than bolt on the cyber part, or the cybersecurity part rather. So the team members that engage in those conversations are always going to have a better outcome within their organization than those that are going truly just by the the existing model.
Yep. Yep. And just understanding, or developing an understanding, among all things, get understanding. You need to
Yeah.
go go understand. One of the things that horrified me, as I was finishing the network assessment, I realized that there were desktops in some of the facilities. They were running Windows 3.1.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of having a fit like several other folks were on the IT side, what, wait, you got to throw that computer away and we've got to put a new one in there. And I'm all like, well, no, let me go talk to the engineer and find out why there's a Windows 3, why there's an old machine running Windows 3.1. And it's because the device that it was managing was 50 years old. There was
Yes.
no upgrades, but there was nothing. And to replace it, there was no money. Okay,
Yeah.
because the replacement for that particular thing was massive. It's a big old control valve, and so you have to sit down, and then it's just like, okay, let's work. How do we mitigate this? How can we do the best we can to secure these handful of machines that are running very, very old operating systems. So that's kind of the other thing. It's just understanding. It's a whole different environment, and that's how I ran into Joe a long time ago, because
Yeah.
I didn't understand. I came from the cybersecurity world, and so I started looking up control system cyber.
Mhm.
And I said, I got to learn about this because I don't know anything about it. And anyway, that's how Joe and I wound up being two peas in a pod in this kind of mess. And then Darrell has joined us. So
Yeah, and that's, I hope other leaders or executives, anybody out there, aspiring leaders, anybody listening to this, or certainly in the future, one of the challenges too, I think Joe and I discussed, is coming into these roles, you almost have to unlearn some things that have been taught, so
Yep.
to understand the other perspective. So I make these cases, kind of leaning on my dissertation here, is we have biases, or cognitive biases. So,
right.
I didn't want to come into an environment where, you make assumptions based on the methodologies that you learn in one side of the industry applies to the next. So when we say we're looking at things through a clean lens and trying to understand and bring this group together, that's very much what our conversation in the IEEE article addresses. We're trying to have the honest conversation. We believe there needs to be more of this going forward. We cover the Purdue model and some of the level 0 security gaps and the terms, uh, of that are implied. But ultimately, we're arguing that the cybersecurity failures are predominantly, it's leadership issues, it's governance failures. It's not technical ones necessarily.
Right.
It's bringing the groups together to address the divide from accountability perspective. And Joe and I are holding each other accountable in this conversation to address the problems that we have.
Yeah. Um, there's some more comments here. It says OT cybersecurity needs to be owned by a company security or business resilience group, not engineering or IT. Um, comments?
I'll wait a little bit, and I like that idea,
Yeah.
honestly. So I do. I'm going to plug a little bit here because I know we talked, Maria, before the show, and I do have a book coming out Friday.
Yes.
I specifically address leadership in these environments. So I can show you that real quick. So if anybody's interested, I'm sure you can share the link. It's Leadership in the Digital Crucible. Um, so I do make some case in here about centralizing the um, the resilience group. I don't necessarily have. I guess I'll say it this way: every organization is different. So if there is an existing executive leader within one group or the other that has a knowledge base that supports that risk ownership,
Yes.
then I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. But there's not a one size fits all, and I'm
I
not,
agree
like I
with
said,
that.
it's not prescriptive to say IT should own it or OT should own it. Um, but I do love that idea that it does have to have a central executive responsible for who owns both the risk and the gap here.
Yeah.
Just my 2 cents is not so much that I'm arguing who should have the ownership. To me, the most important thing is whoever has the ownership has the understanding of the requirements that both sides need to have.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, like I say, engineering doesn't have to own it as long as whoever does understands here's what the equipment needs, or conversely, what you can't do to it. So whoever lays down the law, as long as they know and understand it, I'm okay with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, I'll let Joe plug his book. If you haven't read it, it's definitely on the bookshelf for hopefully everybody in here and everybody I speak to. But I don't know, Joe, if you want to mention
Yeah.
your book as well. This is a seminal book in my opinion. It's what everybody needs to read.
This is the book I wrote back in 2010, and I was doing it because I was testifying to Congress, and congressional staffers had no idea what I was talking about. So, what I tried to do is have a book that explained what are control systems, how are they different, and what has happened. And it was hard as an engineer. I had one equation in the whole book. It was risk equals frequency times consequence. That was the only equation, but as an engineer, you're required to have an equation. But it was really there to try to get people on the IT side to understand what engineers are thinking about, and the engineers to try to understand what IT was thinking about. Um, my thing is this also. We have a couple of, and I use the word couple, of people who are really, really, really good, both engineering and cyber, but that's really, really, really the exception.
Mm-hmm.
What we really need to have are those people that are really, really good in each area, working with each other and having management make sure that that occurs. And if that happens, we're going to be okay. It's just that's not happening very much.
Yep. Yep. Does anyone see any other questions or comments they want to address in the chat? Let's see. Okay, you can see it, right, Joe? You can see the chat?
Let's see. What I can see is,
It should be a little icon in the top right. Looks like a little bubble that you see like in the Peanuts characters. And you click on
okay.
that and it pops it all down. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, I've been watching, I've been looking
yeah.
at the chat or the comments the whole time.
Okay. Oh, good. Good, good. So if anyone doesn't have any other comments, or I put the links to both Darrell's book and to Joe's book on Amazon. And if you have further questions, you can in the comments section of this video leave a comment, and I will make sure I will send the question off to either Darrell or Joe or both, and respond back in the comments. Is it okay if I put your email, the one you sent, Darrell? I just wanted to make sure before I do that.
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay.
Absolutely. So
All right.
I want to thank everybody for taking the time. I know, I always consider time the most valuable resource we have. So,
Yes.
listening to me speak, I never considered myself that interesting. So I thank everybody for listening to the conversation and taking what we have to say seriously because, with the threat we know isn't coming, it's already here. And, especially for critical infrastructure organizations, it's whether that question of whether we're engaging the right people and making the governance decisions, or who owns that. It's not just the technical. It's us as leaders, and it's the community at large. And I feel we're moving in the right direction, but we need to continue the discourse and have these conversations. And like Joe and I said, we're gonna be honest with each other and make the practical recommendations. And we probably have more bad advice than we do good advice. So I appreciate everybody listening to us and hearing our opinions.
You
Joe
know,
and
obviously I thank everybody who is here, but my real thanks goes to Darrell for being willing to, this is going to come out wrong. I'm an engineer, it comes out wrong, but being willing to listen to the issues that's been missing.
Yep.
And I really appreciate everybody. But Darrell, I really wanted to say thank you.
Yes,
All right,
thank you.
and thank you, Maria, for hosting us. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having I enjoyed this immensely, and I always learn every single podcast. It's a learning experience, so I enjoy doing this. So with that, I want to thank our Grid Warrior audience for supporting this channel, subscribing and watching. So I really do appreciate it, and we will be on next week. And so until then, we will see you. Take care.